Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us in our continuing documentary on the evolution of Hamas in the United States. With us here again today is Jennifer Baker.
Hey, how is everyone doing today? Glad to be here.
Awesome. All right, well, let's hop right into the next episode.
So, Laura, in the last episode, we talked briefly about what was happening with Hamas in the mid-2000s in Gaza and the West Bank.
Yes, we did. And I thought we could expound upon that just a little bit by listening to some very insightful comments from Dr. Matthew Levitt.
The Israelis withdrew from the Gaza Strip in 2005. It was a very controversial action within Israeli society. But they did it. They removed all the settlements. They removed all the military bases. And so after 2005, there's actually no occupation of Gaza per se. In 2006, the Palestinian Authority held elections. And the problem with this wasn't that elections are bad, of course, but rather that democracy is not elections. Democracy is civil society. And you hold successful elections on the foundation and the basis of an effective civil society. That didn't exist at the time within Palestinian territories of the West Bank and the Gaza Strip. And so what happened was that the Fatah party that was dominant in the Palestinian Authority, Yasser Arafat's party, was by this point notoriously corrupt. On top of that, they were competing against themselves. So in each municipality, 3, 4, 5, 7, 8 Fatah guys would run and one Hamas guy would run. And so Fatah would split that portion of the vote, that constituency's vote, and Hamas would win with 20-something, 30-something percent of the vote. In one town, I think it was called Kilya in the northern West Bank, a guy that was in prison and never campaigned, never did anything, but he was the only guy for Hamas in the ballot, won the election there. This led to a short-lived national unity government. And it was no surprise that it was short-lived because it was a Hamas-dominated government. Hamas did best in the elections, so it put together what was supposed to be technocratic government, but it set out to undo the Palestinian Authority's security cooperation with Israel. It set about to undo the trajectory towards a two-state solution, trying to portray Israel as the enemy of all Palestinians, and therefore trying to seek a single Islamist Palestinian state in all of what it considered historic Palestine. I know this because, separate from all the other evidence that's out there, after Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force of arms in 2007, remember, this is not force of arms against the Israelis. They left in 2005. This is force of arms against fellow Palestinians, shooting fellow Palestinians, throwing fellow Palestinians off of rooftops. I've met senior Palestinian Authority security officials, asked them, will there be reconciliation between you and Hamas? Because this came up periodically every couple of years. And I've had, senior Fatah security officials say to me, the only reconciliation I have with Hamas is to throw them off of a building as they did to my cousin, as they did to my brother, this type of thing. After Hamas took over the Gaza Strip in 2007, not too long afterwards, maybe early 2008, I went to Ramallah, the de facto capital of the Palestinian Authority in Ramallah, which at this point now is being governed by Fatah again, because once Hamas took over the Gaza Strip by force of arms, they were pushed out of the West Bank. The National Unity Government fell. And I met in one meeting together with a woman who was the head of charity oversight for the Palestinian Authority Ministry of Interior, and the deputy minister of Awqaf, the deputy minister for the ministry that oversaw the religious endowments, the Waqf. The two of them together were overseeing charities and zakats and the interrelationship between them, which you've been discussing throughout the podcast. And they gave me case after case after case of the way Hamas was just creating fake entities to be able to finance Hamas stuff. So there was a jam factory that was getting money, but when they went out to find this jam factory, the street ended and the town ended, and there's like a cliff, and the numbers don't go on down the cliff. There was no jam factory. There was a gym that was getting money. It had Hamas posters all over the place, and it was a gymnasium, but it was a place where kind of pro-Hamas people went to work out and get strong to be able to fight. And they documented for me the ways in which Hamas tried to change the Palestinian Authority from the inside during that briefly held national unity government. At this point in 2007, tensions within the Palestinian political community are very, very tense because there was this fighting by Hamas taking over the Gaza Strip.
That's very interesting. And in the last episode, we also spoke about the HLF trial and that the groups like CAIR were identified in that trial as co-conspirators with the HLF in providing support to Hamas.
Yes, we did.
What was CAIR's response to that?
Well, they denied the allegations and filed a claim against the government stating that that this whole identification of them as a co-conspirator was a mere political trick and not acknowledging that it was an evidentiary, issue that had to be litigated. They were lobbying allegations against the government and the FBI and saying that this prosecution of this terrorist front was a mere political issue and not a terrorism prosecution. But meanwhile, they were also attempting to use the FBI to make themselves appear legitimate.
And how did they do that?
Well, they sought the prestige of attending FBI training events and conferences and other government events, holding themselves out to the public as a legitimate civil rights organization and a partner with the U.S. government. All the while, they were continuing their narratives in the Muslim community that disparaged the war on terror.
And did the FBI realize this?
Yes, reporting indicates that the FBI attempted to disengage from CAIR on an official level. CAIR had worked its way into various levels of government where it was providing so-called training to law enforcement on issues of Islamophobia, where it actually attempted to normalize its narrative and rhetoric, but it also used these relationships to boast about its legitimacy within its own community.
And how did they respond to this disengagement?
Well, they opposed the disengagement because they wanted to use the government as, to help them promote their so-called legitimacy. And they rallied with others and partnered with others in this opposition. They published a press release where they stated that the FBI's actions would result in a number of major Muslim community organizations ending their partnership with the FBI. So threatening to kind of wield their influence in the Muslim community to turn them against the FBI because the FBI was disengaging from them.
And did they completely cut off contact?
Well, I think that was the goal. But as you know, the FBI is a large organization with 56 field offices and thousands of people and hundreds of programs. So it does not appear that they were necessarily successful on all fronts, because there is a report from a U.S. Department of Justice Office of Inspector General that conducted a review of the FBI's adherence to its own policy in 2013. So looking back, did the FBI comply with its stated mission of disengaging with CAIR? And in that 2013 Inspector General report, it found that the FBI had determined it needed to be unified and coordinated in circumscribing the FBI's non-investigative outreach with CAIR to ensure that the FBI was not supporting individuals who support extremist or terrorist ideologies. But that investigation revealed that there had been a failure on the part of the FBI to coordinate this effort, which led to inconsistencies with the various FBI divisions in their interactions with CAIR. The report said the FBI had determined CAIR was not an appropriate partner for formal liaison activities. It also indicated that some FBI offices were not keen to abide by instruction. The OIG report found that in one instance, an FBI special agent in charge attended an event in 2010 where CAIR introduced him and then posted a photograph on their website with the SAC and a description of the events as a CAIR event. And the report said this was exactly the sort of exploitation of contact with the FBI that the policy was intended to avoid and that CAIR wanted to exploit.
So is that the only instance where CAIR was able to do that?
No, they were persistent. The Inspector General's report ultimately found that even though the CAIR policy was introduced 5 years before, so 2008, this was 2013, and reiterated in 2011, that there was insufficient oversight to ensure that new hires, promotions, personnel rotations would understand the policy. And it said, we are concerned that it is possible that FBI staff may not be familiar with the background, history, or objectives of the policy, and the Inspector General recommended effective implementation of the policy relating to interactions with CAIR and comprehensive education to the workforce on the objectives so that the personnel understood what the purpose of it was and what they were supposed to do.
Wow, that is super interesting.
Yes, very interesting.
So what was the AMP doing now, the IAP's replacement organization?
Well, they were helping reinvigorate another group.
And what group is that?
The Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP.
Okay, we briefly mentioned the SJP, and we've seen them a lot in the news these days relating to pro-Hamas activities on campus protests.
Yes, but let's take a minute to discuss how they began. In the early 2000s, a man named Hatem Bazian attended UC Berkeley to obtain his PhD, I think it was in philosophy and Islamic studies, and reportedly founded the first chapter of the SJP during that time. Other reporting asserts the SJP was originally founded earlier, but at least by this time, it was in existence.
We've seen Bastian before in this podcast.
Yes, he is the current chairman of the board for the Muslim Legal Fund of America, the entity that opened 16 days after the HLF was designated as a terror front, and one who defended the HLF against those terror allegations.
Yes, that's right. He was also the co-founder of the AUP with Osama Abu Ashad. Is that right?
Yes, exactly. And before we continue on the SJP's evolution, let's look back at that 1993 Philadelphia meeting where the leaders of the U.S.-based Hamas infrastructure plotted their agenda. Remember, we talked at length about that.
Yes, let's do that. I remembered that they focused on student activism.
Yes, at the meeting, they talked about how their student activism had been strong before, but had become weak at that time, which was 1993 again. And you'll recall that the U.S. Muslim Brotherhood got its start in student associations like the Muslim Student Association, the MSA, back in the 60s.
I do recall us going into that.
Well, these attendees talked about the need at that point, by 1993, to make students aware of their ideology at universities. And they said, quote, carrying out student activism in universities has almost decreased at our end. On the contrary, we must bring it back. Palestinian activism must become active in universities. And then CAIR co-founder and executive director Nihad Awad talked about the need to have internships for students at universities so that the interns, the students, could then come to them at the IAP to write or assist them in activism. And he also said encouraging activism between students and directing them to study media and political sciences. This was Nihad Awad, again, the current executive director of CAIR, talking about this need.
Right. They were keenly aware of the importance of student activism to promote their agenda.
Yes. And this was, in 1993. So by the early 2000s, the SJP, it was a small local chapter. It was a pro-Palestinian student movement. It began to expand to other campuses between 2003 and 2010. But in 2010, a proper description would be that it was a student organization that operated on U.S. campuses and purported to promote pro-Palestinian activism, but whose agenda appeared aligned with pro-terror narratives that labeled terrorist acts as legitimate, quote, resistance, a term that we've become very familiar with in recent years. So they were already couching terrorist activity as resistance at this point. Further, the SJP was closely aligned with the boycott, divestment, and sanctions movement, the BDS movement.
Okay, the BDS movement, that is a movement that was launched in 2005 in the Palestinian territories. And its core foundation relies upon the principle that Israel maintains a regime of settler colonialism, apartheid, and occupation of the Palestinian people. And it calls for the international boycott and divestment from Israel. And the BDS National Committee, BNC, is a collection of numerous Palestinian entities, including the Palestinian National and Islamic Forces, the PNIF, of which designated FTOs, Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, and the Islamic Jihad are a part.
Exactly. And so from its, beginning, once that movement was launched, the SJP was very aligned with the BDS movement. And let's go back forward to 2010, the SJP really started to gain momentum thanks to the American Muslims for Palestine, the AMP. The AMP helped found the National Students for Justice in Palestine in 2010, where together the SJP and the AMP worked on their pro-Hamas campus activism and began to escalate that activity. The SJP and NSJP they're not an official incorporated entity, likely by design to provide plausible deniability for their members' actions. But the AMP operates through a tax-exempt 501c3 called Americans for Justice in Palestine Educational Foundation, the AJP Educational Foundation.
And do we know who they receive their funding from?
Well, the AJP Education, or AMP, their public filings with the IRS are not transparent. But examination of other related entities who have tax-exempt status shows that some of the AMP's funding comes from charity organizations here in the U.S., some even that are subject to current congressional scrutiny, like the United Hands for Relief and Development in Texas.
Okay, and we have not talked about that group yet.
No, we have not.
Okay.
But we will.
So back to the 2010 time period in AMP and SJP. Let's talk about that.
Okay, so in 2010, the AMP hosted a conference for SJP, wherein campus activism was the topic, and there was a recognition of the need, quote, to engage other groups and form connections that will benefit the universal fight for justice and self-identity, tenets that were central to SJP's work.
Okay, and did they engage with other groups?
Yes, they did. They began collaborating with a number of groups that are relevant today that we see involved in a lot of the protest activity. And AMP continued to sponsor SJP events on campuses where they drove inflammatory narratives, like the narrative that Israel is an apartheid state, things like that.
Did their activities pick up at that point?
Yes, their narrative spread and their messaging became increasingly aggressive. And during 2014, so fast forward a few years, a set of circumstances occurred that served as a platform for enhanced protest activities, especially on campuses.
And what was that?
It was a series of events beginning in June of 2014. So Hamas and other Palestinian groups had begun launching an increasing number of rockets and mortars from Gaza into Israel that were hitting or targeting civilian areas. And Israel would respond, and then there were attempts at, ceasefires that Hamas typically rejected because it was not in their interest to have peace with Israel. And then there was the kidnapping and murder of 3 Israeli teenagers in the West Bank. And that was done by Hamas-affiliated militants. So as you can imagine, that escalated the conflict, right? And then further reporting indicates Israel had discovered and began to target a network of tunnels that Hamas had dug from Gaza into Israeli territory, which they believed were intended for attacks and nefarious activities. A lot of, the kind of stuff that we hear about the tunnels today. And so, with that escalation, then the Israeli government instituted what was called Operation Protective Edge, which was a military response in Gaza to the events that had happened.
And what was SJP doing?
Well, they were clearly opposed to Operation Protective Edge and began conducting, protest activities on campuses. They began conducting die-ins where they would lie on the ground and, people would have to maneuver around them, and disseminating flyers that were like mock eviction notices telling, students that they were going to be evicted from their dorms, just like the Palestinians had been evicted from their homes by the Israeli government, and, other various activity. And several of the SJP chapters at universities around the country were criticized, and some were even subject to disciplinary actions for the activities that they were undertaking. A free Palestine was a call that they echoed in furtherance of this. Another of the rallying cries that the AMP was involved in promoting was related to the convictions of the Holy Land Foundation and its officers, what they call the HLF 5. And in one Al Jazeera produced video, Osama Abu Arshad of the AMP gave his opinion on the evidence at trial and implied that the only evidence used to convict the HLF and its officers were forged documents from the Israeli government, notwithstanding the fact that hundreds and hundreds of exhibits from the homes of the defendants and wiretaps of the defendants and testimony of other witnesses indicated to a jury that there was proof beyond a reasonable doubt. Kind of a mischaracterization of the facts again.
أكثر من 8,000 وثيقة. الولايات المتحدة لم يكن عندها وثيقة واحدة أمريكية تدين مؤسسة الهولي لاند فاونديشن. لا يوجد. لا ممكن أن تتكلم عن أدلة ظرفية، عن أدلة أو عن معلومات أو شكوك، لكن لا يوجد دليل واحد إلا دليل إسرائيلي، وهذه الوثائق تم التلاعب بها.
So they were making progress in spreading their narrative.
Yes, and in their collaboration with other groups, they were making progress, and they rallied behind the cause of a woman named Rasmia Odeh.
And who is Rasmia Odeh?
Well, it's a very interesting subject. She's got a very interesting background. So Rasmia Odeh was a key military operative with the Popular Front for Liberation of Palestine many years ago. In 1969, she orchestrated the PFLP bombing of a supermarket that killed 2 students in Israel. And she was convicted for this and her role in plotting of a separate bombing in Jerusalem. So many years ago, before even the first Intifada, she was sentenced to life in prison, but was later the subject of a prisoner exchange between Israel and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine for an Israeli soldier that the PFLP had captured at the time. And despite her convictions as a terrorist operative, she migrated to the United States. But in her moving here, she failed to disclose the fact that she had been convicted of terrorist activity. And ultimately, the U.S. government discovered the truth. And in late 2013, put her into deportation proceedings for failing to disclose the terrorism convictions. And so groups that were aligned with PFLP here in the United States clearly were protesting the arrest and deportation of Rasmia Odeh. She wasn't actually deported until 2017 when the U.S. government deported her to Jordan. But so that's like a 3-year period where you had not only PFLP aligned groups, but your SJPs and AMP really rallying behind her as a heroine for the liberation of Palestine. And even today, Rasmia Odeh is known to virtually from abroad give lectures at universities where she's lauded as a hero and a political prisoner rather than an individual who plotted terrorist activities that resulted in the death of people.
Wow, that's interesting.
So we will get more deeply into Rasmia Odeh and the PFLP and the PFLP aligned groups that the SJP and AMP began to collaborate with, groups that ultimately will be relevant to what is going on in current times. But that will be the topic for another day.
Great. Well, we'll see you next time.
See you next time.